This screencast is aimed at those who want to know a little bit more about basic unit testing in CFWheels. With CFWheels 2, we exposed our main testing suite for use in your apps. It's built on Rocket Unit and has a few extra helpers to make your test code simpler and easier to write. For most applications, we'll want to test a few different things. First, and the easiest, will be to write tests for our globally accessible helper functions. So these might be something simple as a date formatter, or something more complex which is shared in all parts of our application. Then we'll want to write some tests to ensure our models are working as intended, or that our model validations or any custom model functions are working properly. And lastly, we'll want to look at our actual controller requests and test that our filters are properly triggering and that our actual page requests are rendering as we expect. This might not be limited to just looking at the returned HTML, but might include testing for things like appropriately formatted JSON responses, HTTP status codes, and so on. Here I've got a clean Wheels 2 installation running in development mode. And if we look down at the debug footer, we'll see two important links, run tests and view tests. If we click on view tests, we'll get a list of all our apps unit tests where we can either run the entire suite of tests, an individual package, or maybe just a single test. At the moment, there's just a couple of example tests which come by default in a new Wheels installation. They don't actually do anything at the moment, so we can click on any of these and they will pass instantly. So let's start our testing by writing a very simple global function and then writing some tests against it. So we're going to open global functions and we're going to add a new helper function here and we're going to call it myDateFormatter. And we're going to add a description for our documentation. And this is going to take a date parameter. We're going to call it myDate. And this is going to be acquired date myDate. And we're just going to return through the date formatting function what we passed in. So we're just going to put return date format arguments dot myDate, and then we're going to give it a particular string to pass back. So that's all it is really. So very simple, we feed it a date and we should get the formatted string back. So let's write a test for this. In tests functions, we're just going to create a new file and we're going to call this helpers.cfc, and in this we're just going to set up the default sort of test component. Now, the important part is that this extends wheels.test, and we've got two sort of default functions here, set up and tear down, and these will run before and after any test. The actual test functions themselves need to be prefixed with test in order for the testing suite to actually see them. So let's create our test. We're going to just change this to myDateFormatter is valid. So we're just going to give it a name so we know what it's actually going to do. So first we're going to set a variable to pass into that function. Something like that. And then we're going to pass it into the function. And next we're going to set up a string for what we expect. So we're going to call that expected. And this is what we want to be returned. And then lastly, we're going to check the value of what's been returned against what we expect. So we're going to use the assert function. And this is a function specific to the test suite. So in quotes, we're going to say result equals expected. Now, if we go back to our test suite and reload, we should now see functions.helpers. If we just click through to that, we can see that we've got our test name, my formatter is valid, and that's success because what's being passed back into that assert statement is true. And just so you know what it looks like, let's make this test fail by changing this value and reload our tests. And then we've got our failed function. If for some reason you want to actually see the result of what's being turned back, we can use the debug function, which, as you see, just does basically a simple cfdump. Next, we have a quick look about how we might test a model. I've taken the liberty of creating a user model in advance here just for speed. So we've got a simple user model with a validates presence of condition and a calculated property. So we want to write some tests to make sure this functionality is working. So I've created a user model.cfc in my functions folder. And if we just focus on this first one. So on this first one, we're going to just try and make it pass. So what we're doing is we're creating this param struct here with the properties that the user model would normally have. We're passing it through into a new model call, and then we are saving the model, but we're doing it with transaction equals rollback. So this is really useful for when you want to test something, but you don't actually want to write it to the database. So you'll probably be using that almost all the time when testing models. And because the result from the save function is usually a Boolean, we can just do assert result because we're just looking for a true condition here. So if we run that, we can see user passes validation, all good, cool. So next we need to test not just something passing, but something failing. So in this next one, we can add this function, which we're just going to miss out the email parameter. So this should fail, he says. Great. So we've got a result that's false because it didn't save. So that's actually doing what we expect it to do. So we could actually change this to not result, so to be false. We could also go one step further, so we could actually start inspecting the errors. So we could do error equals use dot all errors, and that will return an array. So we can assert that the length of the error array, well, we can just do that because we just want to make sure at the moment that the error array is not empty. So let's try that. And that's now passing because we're saying, yeah, this should fail. And lastly, here's an example where testing is quite useful. I wrote this function before I sort of looked at what the model does. So actually, this will pass because I forgot to put in my model, for instance, any check to see whether email is a valid email address or not. So this passes even though that value is wrong. So what it's done is it's triggered in my head, oh, I need to go back into this model, and I now need to do, say, validates format of email or whatever. So that's just one example of where writing the test first can actually trigger you to write the right code first time. So now I can add this validates format of property equals email line in my model to make sure email is always going to be a valid one.